Hello and welcome to the AIDS 2014 Global Village Connect webinar series. My name is Dean Beck. I will be your host for this very special webinar conversation. Today we're going to talk about understanding the impact of travel restrictions on universal access from the perspective of migrants, sending and receiving countries. It's a conversation that we will have with three people today who are experts in this particular subject, and it's my great pleasure to firstly welcome Peter Wiesner. You are policy and co-chair of the European AIDS Treatment Group, and thank you very much for joining us today, Peter. I'll also introduce AFASAR Syed MOHAMMAD. He is with the International Labour Organisation, and they've been working on programs regarding HIV and AIDS in the global work arena. AFASAR, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And the colourful and world-renowned JULIAN HOWS joins us. Julian has been a long-term advocate for HIV and AIDS, and he is here at AIDS 2014 providing not only a bit of colour and movement, but plenty of good commentary along the way. Julian, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Peter, if I may start with you, the issue around travel restrictions, migration, you've got some facts and figures that you can share with us today.
Yeah, I started working in 1999 on that issue, so I did contact all embassies around the world, all German embassies, and we came up with a questionnaire and asked these countries whether they have restrictions based on HIV status, and we did map the situation. So when we started doing this work, we had about 104 countries that had restrictions for short-term stays and long-term stays, and over time this became a topic that is highly relevant because we can measure first of all state-based discrimination, and there's a huge discussion around this point because there's no public health justification, and the restrictions itself are discriminatory because you would single out HIV and would not allow people to stay in the countries. So after now 15 years, we have nowadays 45 countries that would not allow people mainly for long-term stays to be in a country, and this is a huge problem for migrant workers, not only for migrant workers that are unskilled, this is as well a problem for Europeans. So if you, for example, work for an international NGO in Qatar or in the MENA region, then you will face the problem that you cannot enter the country. So they would ask for an HIV test, and normally recruitment agencies would do that, and so they would test you for HIV, and if you're HIV positive you cannot enter the country, or if you are in the country they would perform an HIV test after 1 year or after 6 months, so they would do it repeatedly, and the result would be that they would deport you. So there are like 25 countries worldwide that would deport people based on the HIV status. And this is, of course, unjustifiable because you have to keep in mind that these people sort of contributed to the growth of society, and so they did work in the country, and what countries would do, they simply would deport them. Sometimes in change, they would put them in prison, and they would just kick them out from the countries.
Can I ask you, what was the original motivation for surveying these countries and these border restrictions? Because that's, I would imagine it's played out differently over the years as we see restrictions affecting key affected populations in various ways around the world. That's a very different motivation to what was potentially the original one.
Well, I mean, I did this work on behalf of the Deutsche AIDS-Hilfe, and everybody knows how Germans are traveling around the world, so you see them all over the place. So at the beginning we thought that this is a problem related to tourism, and but after a couple of years we sort of acknowledged ourselves that this doesn't really target tourists because most of these restrictions would start when you would have the impact when you want to stay longer than 3 months or 4 or 5 months in the country. So we discovered ourselves that this is a problem for migrant workers. So this was a learning experience for ourselves.
Julian, if I can ask you, over the years in your advocacy work with HIV and AIDS, tell us how it's affected your work, just getting around.
Well, affecting my work in getting around, there are various countries that effectively I can't go and work in. It means that I cannot go and do community building for communities in those countries. I cannot do outreach, I cannot talk to their governments, I cannot talk to anybody because I can't get in there. So it makes it very difficult to actually have a proper community response. I will say that Peter has been very right, and the work that he's done is excellent in terms of thinking of, as people living with HIV usually do, we're usually the first people to identify a specific problem and then start to map it out and start to do something about it, because it's the thing that actually affects our lives most. And this is now around entry, stay and residency. On all those things, and as Peter has quite rightly said, many of those laws were created at a time when we didn't know how HIV was transmitted, or had lots of fallacies about it, that we thought that, it's not there in certain countries, but we know there are HIV positive people in every part of the world, both men and women, young and old, straight and gay.
Sometimes it's not there because there are no gay people in this country, or there are no injecting drug users in this country. No publicly acknowledged gay men in the country. No publicly acknowledged. And that is one of the reasons why organisations like the Global Network of People Living with HIV, who I work for, and its partner organisations, actually, we are the best people to actually find ways of reaching out to those communities. Yes, some communities are hard to reach because they don't want to be found by anybody else other than their peers, because then they might talk to them.
Yeah, I think you have to consider that these laws were created in a time like 30 years ago, most of them, where you thought it's a good prevention strategy just to close the borders, to screen people, and to keep HIV outside. But we know now that this doesn't work. I mean, it might work with tuberculosis, but not with HIV, certainly not, because the transmission routes are quite different. And it doesn't make sense to test migrant workers but not test sex tourists that might stay in Thailand and come back to your country. So the whole perception of having this as a prevention strategy is misleading, and it's wrong, and it has the effect that communities or countries might feel safe, and in fact they are not safe, because you simply cannot excluded by shutting out the borders. It doesn't work. We know that now.
AFASAR, the world we live in is very much a globally united one as far as working is concerned. People travel every day, and indeed travel online. How is this playing out? It's got to have an economic impact, surely, that some of the best brains may not be able to travel.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that Peter has said it's one issue that is affecting the human rights. It's affecting the rights of worker. I would just add that it's also affecting economically, not only just companies, but national economies, because when they get workers from other countries, they make a contribution to that national economy. And national governments should recognize that contribution, and in return they should offer all services which any country person should get. So there shouldn't be any discrimination between their own nationals versus those migrant workers who work and make a contribution to their national economy.
What is the fear there? Is there a fear that there'll be a flood of people wanting to access treatment where it's provided for free rather than where they have to fight for it? I
guess it started as a kind of as a strategy which was based on a false sense of security. Countries who impose these restrictions, they felt that by testing people for HIV and not allowing them to work in our countries, and those who are found to be HIV, deporting them to their countries, that way they will be able to protect their own populations. But 30 years in AIDS response, we have seen that it hasn't worked.
Yeah.
So, and it will never work. So these kind of strategies and practices, that's why what we are now saying, that we should document futility of these practices and go back to those countries.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because the natural response in any epidemic as it unfolds is to close the borders, seal off, quarantine, all those sorts of things. It's the default way of operating. But what you're suggesting is that if this particular epidemic, whatever it is at that point in time, continues to stay with us and be ongoing, breaking those borders, it becomes pointless to have these restrictions.
Absolutely. And let me actually give you a very simple case, because we work a lot with migrant workers in different countries. And as you know, ILO, as an international labor organization, has developed this recommendation 200 on HIV and World of Work, which lays down policies that there shouldn't be any mandatory testing for migrant workers, and migrant workers have a right to receive HIV services in both destination countries as well as their host countries, source countries. So, but against that, what is the situation? There's a migrant worker going from, say, Sri Lanka to work in Kuwait, a lady. There's a very serious gender dimension here. She goes and works, and there's a very real case study that we documented. So she goes to Kuwait, her passport is taken by the employer. She cannot go back on her own. She's virtually restricted in that environment in which she's working. She's sexually exploited by her land person with whom she's working. And when she came to Kuwait, she was tested for HIV. She was not HIV positive. But here she is sexually exploited. Her passport is taken. Then she finds, and she's beaten. She's extremely, all her rights are violated. So one day she tries to run away. She runs away from that house, gets into a taxi, requests the taxi driver to take her to airport where she can just find some way or some social organization which could help her. The taxi driver, instead of giving her to a support organization, takes her to a brothel.
And she becomes a sex
worker.
Right.
She becomes HIV positive. Later on, she finds some support. Her brother is contacted in country and manages to get her passport made and goes back to her country. But you know what happens when she goes back to her country? She used to send remittances, whatever she was earning, to her husband. Her husband had built a house from this money. But since she didn't come all these years, remarried. So threw her out of the house. So she is deprived of that support even at home. She's HIV positive, with 2 children, no support from husband. All support she has in her own country is free antiretroviral treatment that she's getting in Sri Lanka. So if you see this whole process from the human point of view, you realize, why are we saying that these practices are inhuman? They violate human rights, they violate right to work, they're discriminatory, and they should learn from countries who have actually changed it. There are so many countries, because as Peter said, when we started in 1999, 100 something plus countries having these restrictions. But now 39, 40 countries. So, which means, an interesting point is, all countries who kind of changed this policy, they never got back to it. So they're happy with the changes they made in their policy.
Julian, as far as just pointed out, we are seeing change, but I know for one that you would rather see it happen a lot quicker. And sometimes these changes are incremental, or they're not a blanket change. Australia is one of those cases.
I'm glad you mentioned it. And Peter will talk far more eloquently to that, but what I will say is that we have seen in an incredible number of countries, as AFASAR has said, where the laws were changed. No, it did not lead to treatment tourism. Number one. Number two, when you look at the fact of providing somebody with health care when they are actually working, it's a marginal cost.
It keeps them productive too.
It keeps them productive too. And when you think about it, that people want to keep healthy, they want to keep alive, they want to, and that is true even both in countries where there is a blanket type national health service, but also in countries where there is a mixed economy of care in terms of provision of health care. the sky has not fallen in the United States. The sky has not fallen in most of Europe by allowing documented and indeed undocumented migrants to actually, access the care system and allow them to access the economic market. And let's face it, when it comes down to it, Europe, for example, and I don't know about Australia, but Europe definitely has an aging population that actually needs an influx of younger, more mobile people to pay for me in my grand old age, for example.
And yes, well, they're cashed up now more than they were 20 years ago, shall we say? The idea of our countries in our neighbourhood, the likes of Papua New Guinea, being ravaged by HIV, and even in the most remotest of hill tribes. We criticise oil companies for a lot of things, but in this particular scenario, they're providing the care to those people. Partly self-serving, they're making sure that their workers are being looked after and their families are being looked after, and they can continue to mine their materials. But this is about a response that integrates government and big business and the most poorest of countries. We've done okay at managing that, but we could do a lot better on that front too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the other things that you have to say is that, of course, one of the reasons why this is not getting the attention that it perhaps deserves is that migration is something which it raises a spectre for every politician. It's not a popular thing. It's not a vote catcher.
And internationally, it's a big issue at the moment.
And internationally, it is indeed a big issue. Migrants don't have don't have votes.
Yeah, and you can, or some politicians think that they can make a big statement, if they are tough on migration and if they're tough or if they play with xenophobia. So this works in many countries. But beside that, I just had a side talk outside, and we wondered how come that these migrant-sending countries are not more outspoken on that. So most of these restrictions, they come from MENA countries, so the Middle Eastern, North African countries. So how come that the Philippines, for example, are not saying, listen, we are not going to accept this anymore? Is it because these countries are too weak, or do they really depend on the money they do get out of their migrant workers? So how come that there's not more around that?
As far as the Philippines, I can tell you the answer. The answer is quite simple. Number one, if you think that 23% of the Philippine economy is supported by overseas remittances, number one. Number two, what you will find is that even though the Philippines has in its constitution a non-discrimination clause, even though the Philippines is doing very well at actually looking after its citizens with HIV, actually, the thing is that there is a grey area. There's a grey area of these supranational employment companies who effectively operate between the MENA region and between the Philippines, and effectively they turn around and say, well, because the MENA region operates a discriminatory policy, we have to do A and B and C, so you have to have a test, and that is the thing that is not being dealt with under international law. The Philippines tries to do things about it, but the minute they put in one set of regulations, effectively another set of regulations pick up. And yes, there's an economic imperative, because that's the way that the Philippines economy is actually supported to a great extent.
You're watching the AIDS 2014 Global Village Connect webinar series. Today we're talking about understanding the impact of travel restrictions on universal access from the perspectives of migrant sending and receiving countries. And we're speaking with AFASAR SYED MOHAMMAD, JULIAN HOWS, and also Peter Wiesner. AFASAR, our very own Qantas found themselves in a bit of a pickle not so long ago when Dubai, one of their main ports, changed the laws around HIV, and Qantas had, I believe, 12 staff that were going to be directly affected and not allowed to enter the country, which is very difficult if you have staff in the air. That's just yet another example of how these laws are not serving us well.
Absolutely, and from the point of view of multinational companies, who operate in a number of countries, and now with globalization, they want to transfer their staff from one country to another so that they get the best of their talent, but they're unable to do that. Which is why you may know that Global Business Coalition on Health, along with the UN AIDS and us, that they are doing a CEO pledge to come forward and make an advocacy for removal of these travel restrictions, because it does affect their business, and they realize it, and because they want to work in every country, and they cannot bring the best of their staff in those countries. So I would also like to say, from the point of view of trade unions, the trade unions are extremely concerned about the rights of workers being violated, because they are always concerned about workers' rights, and they are willing to work with governments on this issue. But the challenge here is that there are so many stakeholders who are involved in handling this issue. Because if you look at the issue of migrant workers from the HIV point of view, one stakeholder is the Ministry of Health, because they are dealing with the national AIDS programs. Another important stakeholder is the Ministry of Employment and Foreign Employment. Recruiting agencies, third important stakeholder. Trade unions, fourth. So, the real challenge is, how does one bring these different stakeholders coming together, and also from sending and receiving countries, to find a solution? So that is one challenge. And I think these international workshops like AIDS conferences could really have more discussion on these issues, and bring these stakeholders together. We just had a Global Village session, and I think we got very good perspective, because we heard parliamentarians, we heard trade unions, private sector, and people like Peter and ILO on UN8 on the same platform. But those platforms are very few. But we need to talk more, and we need to really capture evidence and present it to those stakeholders. That, look, it does not work. These are practices which are very old, developed because of certain concept which was on a wrong notion, and it has not tested the time, and it's time to change that, and you must change that. I would also add that migrant worker is not just a worker who's at the front line, or who's illiterate, or who is less skilled. There are lots of very high profile workers who are also facing this problem.
In fact, our country is importing them in specific skilled areas.
And you may know this famous case of a South African journalist who got a job with Al Jazeera. And he went there to join. He was tested for HIV and deported. So imagine if it can happen to a journalist. And media did pick up that case. But thousands and thousands of workers are being deported every day. They're not being deported.
Absolutely. And what's the message it actually gives out if you're living in a country which is treating people with HIV like that? We heard a very eloquent tale from Oe from the Philippines, who was taken to, was tested abroad, and was put into shackles, was put in a cell for 4 days, was vilified across all the national press, was taken in shackles to the airport or put on a plane. He was put on a plane without any pre or post-test counselling. He wasn't even, when he was put on a plane, he knew very little about HIV, and he wasn't even told who to contact back in the Philippines. Now, if I am a Saudi or somebody from one of the MENA states where that is happening, and I look, my God, that is the way they treat people with HIV. Are you going to come forward? If you think you might have been at risk, are you going to think, well, of course it will treat me differently because I'm Saudi? Oh no, I might have my name in the paper. And that, we know, is actually happening. So the impact is also really bad for the public health in those countries itself.
Yeah, and for the community, it is absolutely disempowering. We have the cheaper principle, the greater involvement of people living with HIV. This is our concept we work in, and these restrictions they tell exactly the opposite of that. And in terms of HIV testing, everybody knows that only voluntary HIV testing puts people on treatment and doesn't drive them underground. So that's why I don't like the so-called changes in Australia. They still have mandatory HIV testing for people who want to live here, and this is not acceptable.
Thank you, Peter.
There, as you know, are plenty of arguments to suggest that we should have it, but what we are seeing, particularly with the influx of migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa to Australia, we've had, they have been a big chunk of our immigration quantities recently, and what we are seeing is people coming into the country with HIV. It is affecting, if you like, our bottom line, our figures, but they are isolated as a line item, so they're not, in that sense, directly affecting our local population figures. But there's been a move recently to ensure that people who are travelling here, people who land here for any form of asylum or immigration, are to be are able to access treatment and to do so unrestricted. And I think that is an advance that AIDS 2014 has brought to the fore.
Absolutely, this is an advance, but it doesn't limit the fact that you perform the test mandatorily. This is a bad practice, and this, just results to this just contributes to the discrimination people living with HIV and AIDS face. Why do you single out HIV? Why don't you test for cancer? Would be much more beneficial. Why HIV? I don't understand that. What is the concept behind? So are we still the dangerous people for the general population? I assume yes.
That's the message.
This is absolutely discriminative, and this is not acceptable. And as long as you keep on doing that, you will be on the list of red countries that discriminate people living with HIV. I'm sorry, but this won't be changed. Even if you guarantee that there's non-discrimination, I believe you guarantee that, and this is a success. But the fact that you still test mandatorily is not acceptable.
Yeah, that's a good bottom line, Peter.
As far there are 44 countries around the world where we currently have some form of border discrimination around HIV. There is more in the Asia Pacific region, and there's quite a lot in the Arab regions. These are two areas that are currently at the forefront of the HIV epidemic. They're copping it worse than anyone at the moment. How can we import the knowledge and the know-how that they need if they don't have the laws and the political will to adopt it?
We need to look at some of the opportunities that exist now. One opportunity is the Arab AIDS strategy, which has been recently developed, and they are trying to look at this issue very particularly. So, and this is one of, and they have also tried to align their strategy and the goals with the UN Political Declaration of 2011 and removing travel restrictions and making changing punitive laws is one very important component. And in doing that, attempt by the global community is to get them together to talk. In this conference also, today we are having a discussion on HIV in conservative social settings, which is being organized by International AIDS Society and OFID, and I'm speaking there. So we are basically trying to create occasions where we bring those stakeholders who are attending the conference and let them talk to those who have changed things, so that they talk to each other and they understand that by changing, change is always difficult. Nobody wants to change, particularly if they have a policy and practice which is age old. They want to change it easily. But we need to go back, do more advocacy, present good examples, and tell them that none of the countries who actually who changed their policy have gone back to that. So they're happy with it.
What we can actually do within the countries that are, facing the brunt of the epidemic, especially in Southeast Asia, and we always saw, for example, the Philippines as being an example of low and slow. and that has now changed, especially amongst gay men. Especially amongst gay men, we need to actually support the civil society organisations that are working there, because we know that civil society and people living with HIV are probably the best people to actually reach out into their communities and actually do the work of getting people on treatment, of keeping them safe, of educating their own communities. That is what Australia told us a long time ago, and let's export it again.
Julian, you've been to many of these conferences. How much of it is a talk fest that ends up going nowhere, and how much good does come out of these things? Let's focus on this issue, this issue of migration and HIV laws discriminating. Is there a chance that there'll be a shift anywhere along the paradigm from this conference alone?
Well, I think you've already talked about Australia. You bring a conference somewhere, and they suddenly think, "Oh, let's tidy up our act a bit."
We have played a huge game of catch-up, I have to tell you. A huge game of catch-up.
And that was, that has been true to a certain extent, and I think it might be true about some of your other local policies, like criminalisation in the state of Victoria.
Yes.
So that's one of the good things about bringing the circus to town. Sorry. But yes, you are quite right. It is a bit of a circus, and after my 14th, 15th
And here's the
conference,
thing, not every country can afford to host it to get the kick up the butt to make these things happen. We've been fortunate enough, in some regard, that has taken place. It's not going to happen in Papua New Guinea tomorrow.
No. But I think we need the International AIDS Conference is only one way of spotlighting things, and it might actually be the time, now that we are in a more stable and more joined up way of thinking, that we don't need one of these damn circuses once every 2 years, that we could actually have it once every 3 years, that we do not need the International AIDS Society, which is effectively a trade association for AIDS professionals.
You're not the first person to tell me
the
this.
community has taken over to a certain extent, that we actually have it once every 3 years, that we have smaller, more local conferences, that we have smaller, more higher dialogue meetings. I've sat in the Philippines with the World Bank, with the people there, with UN AIDS, and things have come out of that. So we need to think more innovatively about the ways that we do leverage and pressure, both as Fos says in some ways inside the tent. The quiet diplomacy from inside, and that's really was really useful. And also actually turning around and getting Joe Australia, Joe Britain, or like Fritz German, who actually knows that violations are happening, and writing to the government and writing to their embassy in turn and say, what are we doing about this? Pressure that way, for example. Pressure. If you look at the embassies in the countries, what are they actually doing to do that sort of that diplomacy, and once again supporting local organisations. We have spawned and created a huge, great big bloody AIDS industry, and I've been living with HIV, but I'm also living off of HIV to a certain extent. But when it comes down, we've spawned a huge baby, and sometimes we've forgotten that the people who affect change are people from the community on the ground, and how do we support them better?
And sometimes, how do we get them to re-engage? Peter, your connection to this has been a long one. I want to bring in a slightly different mode of conversation around an emerging issue in your home country, and that is of sexually transmissible infections becoming untreatable. It brings back into play this thing around borders and globalisation, and is the untreatable gonorrhea going to take over the world like HIV once did? Your thoughts?
I think this won't happen. I don't see this as a reality, and the concept that these strains of gonorrhea come from other countries doesn't really it seems to me to be completely stupid. I'm sorry. So why should it come from Russia, and we should close the border to Russia or to Ukraine or whatever? This is a concept that doesn't really match. We've seen this with HIV, and it won't work with gonorrhea or with anything else. We live in a globalized world, and we have to accept the fact that we don't live in the 30s anymore. I'm sorry.
As for the threat of SARS and swine flu, etc., has something comes up every 5 years or so, and the globe reacts in a reactionary way and spends a lot of money in these areas. Have we learnt anything that will affect that landscape, that reactionary response from countries around the world?
Those like swine flu and all, they are a bit different because you see immediately some impact on people dying, being hospitalized and everything.
It's not in the bedroom it's
not
being
in the
transferred,
bedroom. The difference that HIV goes through is that it goes unnoticed for years. So there are no symptoms. I don't know
unless there's a video, but yes.
Yeah, so that's what I think. One of the reasons why these countries are feeling that they don't have a problem and they are in denial is because they don't see their own people living with HIV. If you look at the new data which is coming up, in MENA region, infections are on the rise. And these are not migrant workers, they're the local people as well. Who are, but the thing is, HIV goes such slowly in a long asymptomatic period. There are no immediate symptoms. You don't get to recognize this problem immediately.
And I mentioned the hill tribes of Papua New Guinea, some of the most remote populations in the world affected by this. They've been fortunate enough, I guess you could say, to have the oil companies step in and provide care and treatment. What role does private enterprise play in this landscape in your area of work? I mean, it's got to be big.
Yeah, private enterprise has to do a number of things. Private enterprise, first of all, should recognize that no matter how much technology develops, workers are still going to be very important. So they need to invest in health of workers. And those companies who have developed workplace programs for their own employees, they are seeing the benefit of it. They are seeing that it is good for the morale of the staff. They trust the employment management much more, and they are much more productive. That is for the
It's a no-brainer, really, surely.
Yeah. And secondly, to the outside world, it's good for the corporate image of the company.
Yes.
And I've seen that phase changing. Initially, companies would be shying to even start a workplace program because they thought it may not be good for our corporate image. What would others think? If I'm starting a workplace program in my company, does that mean
what's wrong?
What's wrong?
Yeah.
Do I have a lot of employees who are infected and all? But then, over a period of time, when they did the program, they developed a policy, and they assured that your jobs are protected, there will be no discrimination, you access treatment, knowledge, awareness. And then they realized that it was so nice for the corporate image. So more and more companies started getting into it. But yes, we had to face a lot of advocacy challenge and similar things. So, but we have seen advocacy working, as Julian says, maybe a bit slow results, but results are coming in. And I'm happy to see that this year the UNAIDS report, GAP report, has a whole section on migrant workers. They have identified 12 subpopulations, and migrant workers are one of them. And there are regional snapshots where the situation in some of those countries was still in denial or need to do much more is also talked about, and what they should be doing is talked about. But from the point of view of HIV and employment, the report is also very important. And that's what I would like to emphasize here. And we have been saying it, that people living with HIV don't just need treatment. They basically need three things. First thing is no discrimination, to live with dignity without any discrimination in every sector, health, family, workplace, so no discrimination. Second thing, they have a right to treatment. Of course, there's a problem which is treatable. Nobody should die in the absence of treatment, and treatment should be provided. And we must make sure that treatment is sustained. As of now, 80% of treatment is provided by the donor funding. So domestic governments have to come forward and put in their own money to make sure that treatment continues.
Those first two factors are a major player in being able to sustain the treatment.
But the third component, which is a missing component in the AIDS response, is the employment angle. Because if people have jobs, they will adhere to treatment better. They will be able to take care of their families. They will have some income to live comfortably, and that is not recognized so much. And if you look at the new UNAIDS report, it says unemployment rates amongst people living with HIV are 3 times higher than the national unemployment rates. What does it tell us? You're not being employed. And we need to do much more on HIV and employment.
And that goes back to well-being and self-worth and those fundamentals of human existence, surely. Julian?
No, absolutely. I mean, we are now in a situation, I suppose, at least for Peter and I sitting at this table, we were infected quite a long time ago. We probably had a dislocation. We actually probably thought, I'm going to be dead in the next few years. And probably had periods of quite an amount of illness. So we, dislocated totally from that whole experience. And now, thankfully, we've both got back into it. So I think there are two things here. Number one, there is what do we do with those people who effectively have, especially in the Western world, and especially in Australia, who have had a dislocated trajectory
and not got back into the game,
or got back into the game so late that effectively they're going to have to work until the very, very end. They haven't got a good pension. They haven't got X, Y, Z. So there's that whole category of people. There's another category of people that, if you look at it, we are going to have in this world. In the United States of America, by 2020, there are going to be 1 million people over the age of 55 living with HIV. In Kenya, in Thailand, everywhere there has been treatment in place, and it hasn't been a salvage therapy, it's been a first-line therapy. We are going to have a whole load of people who will be coming out of the job market, in effect, or working towards retirement. Now, what social protection schemes do we need to put in place for those? How are we going to... We need to be much cleverer, because we've always had the argument, and it's a very good argument, that give me work, I can contribute, I can look after myself, my family, however you define that, and I can be a net contributor. Now then, if you get to the age of, I'm nearly 60, you've got 7 more years. I haven't got a big pension. Now, how does my government justify paying the £7,000 a year that it requires for my treatment alone when I'm 68? And how do we plan for it?
But the other side of that is, and it's like a full circle, we come back to the tourism side of things, and these people in retirement will be travelling the world. And they'll be spending money, they'll be travelling the world. And we've gone right around in a big circle. Peter, your hopes for this conference and this particular subject, what's the big goal, if you like?
Well, the big goal that I have would be a campaign, a discussion. I would use the Qatar sports event that will take place in a couple of years, because it is in one of the countries that highly discriminates, and the whole region is most problematic. You have millions of migrant workers there from Asian countries. And we've seen the example from Russia with the Olympics, how the gay movement sort of created this campaign to shame the country and to bring this up. So I just wonder why and how come that we as the global migration movement does not address this issue and this event in Qatar and bring the topic on the table. I mean, we know about the cross violations of the migrant workers in all respects, but I've never heard anybody mentioning the situation of HIV positive migrant workers in the region. So I think this would be a big chance to develop a strategy and to discuss that. So I came up with proposals to discuss this here at the conference. It was turned down for some reason, because maybe Qatar is too far away, I don't know. But I would have liked to have a discussion here at the conference and to build up a strategy together, maybe with IOM, with ILO, with civil society, with UNAIDS. I think it's time to think about this event and how to use the event to talk about the issues that are really important for us.
Qatar is 8 years away or so.
Yeah, I think it's...
Do we have to wait 8 years to get some movement on this?
Well, I think it's always good to be aspirational and have long-term goals.
Well,
I think there are short-term goals. I think there are short-term goals as well. I mean, so I'm quite sure that your the European HIV organisations in Australia will be pushing and nudging your government, whomever it might be, in a year's time. And I think one of the other interesting things, especially about the criminalisation statute that you had, was sort of knocked down to a certain extent in Victoria, is that was not, well, it's a movement. It's a movement.
We're
in the
now
right place.
talking about it.
Yes.
Yes.
But it was bipartisan as well.
Indeed, yes.
And that is really quite important, And I think that's the other thing that we need to do. Building alliances takes a little bit of time. Putting the pressure always takes a little bit of time. I would turn around and say that, you very wealthy Aussies, because a lot you are, you're not feeling the pinch as much as we are in Europe. You might like to think twice, for example, about going to a country that discriminates. You might even think to yourself, well, it was a toss-up between somewhere that discriminated against people living with HIV and somewhere that didn't, and actually the other place was nicer anyway. But then just write a little letter to the embassy. We have to do what we can as individuals. And I think that people like Deutsche Hilfe and EATG and the Global Network of People Living with HIV are always trying to listen also to people in the countries where the things are hardest, and not to go in and provide our solutions, but listen to them. What do they want us to do? And that is just as true as what's happened in Uganda with the laws around criminalisation and homosexuality, and what is happening in Russia. We need to listen to the people from those communities on the ground and help build their response, because their response is the one that's going to be sustainable and actually will make the change.
2 years ago, there was a big shift in the US. It's why the US hosted AIDS 2012. Was that a bigger shift than what has occurred here in Australia?
Oh, absolutely and
right.
totally.
Tell us why.
And we had, we had Senator Matt McCoy, as a Republican, is a Democrat from Iowa, who was saying, well, yeah, it moved things because there is no bar on entry, stay, or residency. There is not an economic test that is going on. So there is freedom. We challenged him that actually that freedom, still needs to push further in terms of sex workers, in terms of drug use. And he said, well, point well taken. The argument that I've heard from Australia, right, is, of course, we can't do what the Americans do with their Statue of Liberty Declaration, as one or two of your politicians have called it. Give me your poor teeming masses, because in effect, yes, you let them in the country, but then you don't give them healthcare. At least in Australia, we look after everybody, and that's why we need to have the economic test. That's the story.
If your boat's not turned around.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. But, I think it's as Peter was saying, I think it's a fallacious argument. But that is why it was so different, because it actually decided to turn around and say, went quite a long way towards turning around and say, yeah, come in, because we know you make economic worth. We know that you create worth.
And we know we can't stop it anyway.
And we know, absolutely.
Really?
And that's actually very pragmatic.
As for your hopes longer term, any goals for this particular area of freeing up our borders?
The hope, the long-term goal is that no country should have these restrictions, and we should work towards that. And we should have short-term goals and long-term goals. I talked about the Arab AIDS strategy, which was adopted this year, where health ministers were brought together and they have agreed to work on it. And we in the UN are trying to help them by presenting good examples, by presenting evidence, and we do it in a number of ways. We make use of events like this to talk about it, but challenge in these events is that not all countries are represented and not the right stakeholders are here. So we also try to make missions, to take missions to those countries. So ILO and UNAIDS, we have been to PNG, we are planning a mission to Singapore in coming months to just talk about these issues, to meet with officials. So we have seen that actually change begins to start more on a bilateral basis. When you follow up either after an international event or you do a bilateral mission and then try to continue to provide. Because you need to, when you sit face to face, then you try to understand reasons. Why are they doing it? Is there an ignorance issue? Are there some other societal pressures, challenges? And you try to provide them that kind of solution. So we do try to gather some evidence and meet with countries more on a bilateral basis. And we also then partner with all organizations who have a similar interest, because there's no single agency can do it alone. Which is why we are working with OFAID, we are working with the International AIDS Society. In this conference, there's this conservative HIV, addressing HIV in conservative social settings, a discussion. And there was a meeting in Vienna before this conference where this issue was discussed. And this session, which is happening this evening, is a follow-up of that. So we brought people together, including religious leaders from these countries, to look at what role can religion play, what role can politicians play, and then we issued a call to action.
I think it's certainly, in some countries, it certainly does have a major role to play.
So we got to do advocacy with religious leaders, and we need to, and we are seeing some good examples, and religious leaders are coming forward. So we see their change happening, and we are happy with that change, because they realize that human lives are important.
And as far as what I would say to you as a challenge that I throw down to ILO from the community is that when you had those high-level meetings where you bring the really important people in to talk to the really important people in government, take somebody living with HIV from a neighbouring country, and then maybe those people will not actually see that, that they are actually human, because that, I think, is also really, really important, and would be a good way of ILO and UNAIDS showing that the JIPA principle is alive and strong within their own organisations, because you can't do something for us without us.
No, you know that. We do it with you. Even the social protection study that we did was with you. So, no.
We have,
yeah, thank you.
Peter, in wrapping up, can you tell us what can the man in the street do to help progress this issue?
Well, I think just acknowledge the facts that these restrictions are based on wrong perceptions. Just acknowledge the fact that people living with HIV on treatment are not infectious anymore. They cannot possibly transmit the virus. Fact number one. Fact number two, we have a normal life expectancy. Fact number three, we are healthy and we can work as anybody else. So if you acknowledge these facts, then it must be, even if you are blunt and stupid, it must be crystal clear that the concept to exclude these people is simply discriminative, and it doesn't have any, doesn't really, it's brainless. And I think people are capable to understand that. And if people are capable to understand that, then governments are capable to understand that as well. And just make the point that these restrictions are discriminatory itself, and that politicians might sometimes be tough on migration, and this is another layer that would, if somebody thinks politically, it would be a no-go for me to elect those people. So I think there's a lot. There is some space to do it better in future, and people are not as stupid as we think. So if we come up with the fact and tell it again and again and again, then we have to recognize that these restrictions are simply not justifiable anymore. They are a relic from a time that has passed. And we have, of course, slow thinkers, so it might take another 30 years more, but at the end of the day, everybody should understand that this is simply ignorant.
Julian, what would you like to suggest to anyone watching, what they could do to help progress this?
Well, I think I've already made some of the suggestions, and I am assuming that anybody listening to this is not listening to this and then, writing down a green thing, that those people are stupid. So I hope, viewer, listener out there, you're either on our side or have been persuaded by some of the arguments. That's the first thing, you know. And if you haven't, dig down into it a little bit more, because you're not sitting there for nothing. We're not giving up our time for nothing. Do some homework. Second thing is, I think that, yes, as Peter has said, look at, you know, what is your government doing about it, and get down into the core of yourself. Think to yourself, well, how many people do you know who weren't born in your town or your street or your country? And has that enriched your life? You know, whether it's the person who drives your cab, who mends your teeth, who does your, you know, all those people. And you think, well, how many of them? And then you think to yourself, okay, would it really matter if they had HIV? You know, so dig down into yourself around those sorts of things. And then I think you'll find the right way that you can do action within yourself to actually counter what sometimes, because it's such a difficult thing, isn't it? Sometimes your government hasn't got the guts to do, which is actually wake up to the science and wake up to the facts and actually change things voluntarily without being dragged there by an electorate. And of course, with an election politics, this is small fry, I'm afraid. And that's one of the difficulties, you know. But that shouldn't stop us from challenging it, you know, all the way through.
Julian Hows, AFASAR SYED MOHAMMAD, and Peter Wiesner, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar series for AIDS 2014. It's been wonderful to get your insights into what is globally quite a delicate issue at times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us on the AIDS 2014 Global Connect webinar series. I'm Dean Beck. We'll see you again for the next one very shortly.